The police showed up at 8:37 on a Sunday morning. Not one car, two. I was halfway up a ladder on the side of my garage, holding a drill in one hand and a section of cedar trim in the other, when I saw the cruisers roll slowly down my gravel drive like they already expected a problem. And standing just behind them, arms folded, sunglasses on, lips pressed into that thin little line she always wore when she thought she was about to win, was Diane Holloway, my HOA president, my neighbor, and the woman who had spent the last month trying to convince everyone in Cedar Ridge that I was some kind of dangerous, unstable man ruining the community. I climbed down slowly, set the drill on the workbench, and watched the officers step out. The older one looked calm. The younger one looked alert. Diane looked thrilled. That was the part I remember most. Not the cars, not the uniforms, her face. Because people like Diane only look that satisfied when they think authority has finally arrived to do what their bullying couldn't. The older officer took a few steps toward me and said, "Sir, we received a complaint regarding threats, trespassing, and unlawful construction." I looked at him, then I looked at Diane, then back at him. And in that exact second, I knew this wasn't just another HOA complaint. This was escalation. This was Diane deciding paperwork hadn't worked, gossip hadn't worked, fake notices hadn't worked, so now she was going to try uniforms. What she didn't know, what she absolutely should have known before dragging police onto my land, was that I had cameras on every corner of the property, permits for every single thing I was building, and 6 weeks of footage showing exactly who had been trespassing, threatening, and lying. She thought the police were coming to shut me down. They were actually about to become witnesses. And by the time those two officers drove away, Diane Holloway wasn't the one giving instructions anymore. She was the one explaining herself. My name is Nolan Mercer, and I moved to Cedar Ridge, outside Colorado Springs, after my marriage ended. I didn't come there because I loved the HOA. Nobody loves an HOA. I came because the house had what I needed: distance from my old life, a detached garage, enough yard to work with my hands, and no rear neighbor close enough to feel like they were sitting in my living room. The place had good bones, but bad timing. The fence leaned, the garage trim was rotted, the backyard looked like nobody had cared about it since the recession, which honestly made it perfect for me. I wanted something I could rebuild, quietly, without having to explain myself. For the first few months, that's exactly what I got. Then Diane Holloway became HOA president. Diane was the kind of woman who spoke softly so she could act like every cruel thing she said was simply administrative. Mid-50s, always perfectly dressed, always carrying some folder or clipboard, always somehow appearing at exactly the moment something on your property had started looking better without her permission. The first time she came over, I was replacing the side fence gate. She stood at the edge of my driveway and said, "I wanted to make sure you're aware that exterior modifications need to align with neighborhood standards." I looked at the broken gate, then at her. It's a gate. It's visible. That was Diane in 2 words. It's visible. As if the crime wasn't what I was doing, but that she had to look at it. I told her the gate was a replacement, same height, same footprint, better materials. She smiled politely. Sometimes intent isn't the issue. Perception is. That sentence should have told me everything. With Diane, perception was always the weapon. If she could make enough people perceive a problem, she didn't need a real one. The trouble really started when I put in the privacy wall. Not a giant one. Not a fortress. Just a clean cedar screen along the west edge of my yard to block the direct line of sight from the walking path behind the drainage berm. People using that path could see straight into my patio and kitchen if the blinds were open, and after a few months of feeling watched every time I stepped outside, I was done being reasonable about it. I checked the HOA guidelines. I checked the city code. I filed the architectural request. Approved. In writing. That should have ended the matter. Instead, it made Diane furious. At the next HOA meeting, she called the screen an aggressive visual barrier. Aggressive. like cedar slats were loading weapons at night. I reminded her it had been approved. She said approvals could be revisited in light of community concerns. There were no community concerns. There was Diane. That's all there ever was. From that point on, the complaints multiplied. My gravel arrangement was too uneven. My garage trim color was excessively dark. My work trailer was visible for too many hours during active repairs. And the funniest one of all, my rosemary planters near the back patio allegedly created a cluttered visual tone. A cluttered visual tone. That was the kind of nonsense she sent in official letters. At first, I just saved the notices. Then I started saving everything. Emails, photos, dates, and eventually, camera footage. Because once you realize somebody is trying to create a story about you, documentation stops feeling obsessive and starts feeling necessary. The first major clip came on a Thursday afternoon. Diane entered my side yard through the half-latched gate while I was at the hardware store. She stood beside the privacy wall, took pictures from 3 angles, then pointed toward the garage while talking to someone on speakerphone. The audio wasn't perfect, but one sentence came through cleanly. If code enforcement won't react, police presence might. That line sat in my head all night. Police presence might. Not because she thought I was dangerous, because she thought police would be useful scenery. That's the ugly truth about people like Diane. They don't care what authority is for. They care what it looks like when it arrives. So I upgraded the cameras. Front drive, side gate, garage corner, patio. If she wanted to build a narrative, I was going to build a record. Good thing I did. Because over the next 2 weeks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She walked the edge of my property 3 separate times. Once with another board member, once with a man from the landscaping committee, once alone, just after dusk, stopping near the back gate like she was checking whether I'd left it unlocked. Then came the fake notices. One was zip-tied to my side gate and claimed there was an active review of setback noncompliance. No seal, no case number, no city department listed, just formatted to look official enough to scare someone who didn't know better. I took pictures and bagged it. Then came the rumors. A neighbor asked whether the city had red-tagged my garage. Another asked whether I was allowed to run power tools after the incident. There had been no incident, which meant Diane had started talking. Again. Always softly, always carefully, always with just enough vagueness to protect herself and just enough poison to spread. By then, I was talking to an attorney. Her name was Rachel Boone, and after reviewing the notices, the approval letters, and the first round of footage, she said exactly what I hoped she'd say. She's trying to manufacture enforcement. Bad? For her, Rachel said. Potentially catastrophic. Then came Sunday morning. I was repairing the outer garage trim, coffee half finished on the porch rail, when the police rolled in. The older officer introduced himself, then asked, "Are you Nolan Mercer?" "Yes." "We received a complaint that you threatened an HOA representative, obstructed access, and are conducting unpermitted work after being warned to stop." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because every single part of it was backwards. I said, "Would you like to see the permits first or the footage?" That threw him off for half a second. Then he asked, "You have documentation?" "Yes." Behind him, Diane shifted her weight. Tiny movement. But I noticed it. She hadn't expected me to sound calm. That's the thing bullies count on. They don't just want authority to show up. They want you flustered when it does. I wasn't. I invited the officers to the driveway table by the garage and brought out the permit folder. City approval for the electrical upgrade. HOA approval for the privacy wall. Receipts for the trim materials. Inspection sign-off from 2 weeks earlier. The younger officer flipped through the pages, then looked toward the garage. "All this is current?" "Every bit." Then I opened the camera app. First clip, Diane entering my side yard without permission. Second clip, Diane photographing the privacy wall while saying, "Police presence might." Third clip, Diane and another board member standing at the back fence while she said, "If he won't respond to letters, uniforms change behavior." That one hit hard. The older officer watched it twice. Then he looked over his shoulder at Diane. Her face had changed. The smile was gone. What replaced it was that brittle, frozen expression people get when they realize a private plan has suddenly become very public. The older officer stood and said, "Ma'am, could you come over here?" Diane walked up with the posture of someone still trying very hard to look official. She said, "This is being taken out of context." Of course it was. Everything always was. The officer asked, "Did you enter his property without permission?" "I was documenting a violation." "Did you have authorization?" "I'm HOA president." He just stared at her. It was one of the most beautiful silences I've ever heard. Then he asked, "Did he threaten you?" She hesitated. He was intimidating. That wasn't my question. That was the moment the whole thing shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. You could feel the authority move away from her like water draining from a cracked bowl. She started talking too much after that, about community concerns, about visibility, about prior interactions, about how residents had been nervous. The younger officer asked, "Nervous about what exactly?" Diane said, "His behavior." He pointed to the permit folder. "The behavior where he repairs his own garage?" I had to look away for a second so she wouldn't see me smiling. Then the older officer asked the question that ended her morning. "Why did you report threats if your main concern was construction?" Diane opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "We needed someone official to come out." Needed. Not because there was danger, because she needed a scene. That was all the officers needed to hear. They didn't arrest her. Not then. But they did make her step away from my driveway and stop talking while they finished the report. The older officer took a separate statement from me and asked me to email the footage directly. He also photographed the fake notice I'd saved in a plastic sleeve from the shed and made note of the HOA approval paperwork in case the complaint escalated. Before leaving, he turned to Diane and said, in the calmest possible voice, "Ma'am, HOA authority does not replace law enforcement judgment, and it definitely does not authorize false reporting." She tried one last move. "I was acting in the neighborhood's best interest." The younger officer actually said, "No, ma'am, you were acting in yours." Then they left. Diane stood there for about 5 seconds in total silence. Then she turned and walked back across the street without looking at me. For the first time since she moved against me, she looked small. Not defeated. Not yet, but smaller. Like she had finally discovered there was a difference between being feared in committee meetings and being taken seriously by people with actual authority. Rachel filed the next morning. Harassment, trespass, interference with lawful property improvement, potential false report issues, request for injunctive relief. And because Diane had used her role as HOA president to create fake authority around my house, Rachel also demanded preservation of every board email, text, and internal note tied to my property. That's when Cedar Ridge started panicking. One board member resigned. The management company suddenly got very cooperative. And within a week, Rachel had internal emails showing Diane had been pushing for visible intervention at my property because owner resistance had made ordinary compliance pressure ineffective. Visible intervention. There it was again. She didn't want a solution. She wanted a spectacle, something the neighborhood could see. Police in the driveway, questions at the mailbox, rumors that I was difficult, unstable, uncooperative. She wanted my house to look contaminated by trouble. What she got instead was discovery. And discovery hates people like Diane. Because once her emails were printed out and read in daylight, they sounded exactly as ugly as they really were. One message said, "If officers show up, he'll understand he's not untouchable." Another said, "The point is pressure, not citation." That line became Rachel's favorite. At the hearing, she used it like a knife. "The point is pressure, not citation." She read aloud. So this wasn't about a lawful complaint, was it? It was about using police presence as leverage in a private dispute. Diane's attorney tried to object. The judge overruled. Then Rachel played the clips. The side yard trespass. The police presence might comment. The uniforms change behavior line. And finally, the body cam note from the responding officers that the alleged threat claim appeared unsupported by any evidence on scene. The judge looked exhausted by the end of it. Not angry. Exhausted. Like he had spent too many years watching petty people discover new ways to cosplay authority. The order came down a week later. No direct contact, no unsupported enforcement efforts, no HOA action against my approved property work, absent documented basis, and a specific warning that using police or official-sounding notices to pressure homeowners in private disputes could expose both individuals and associations to serious liability. Diane resigned 11 days later for personal reasons. That phrase always makes me laugh. As if the personal reason wasn't that everyone had finally seen exactly who you were. These days, the garage is finished. The trim is clean. The privacy wall is still there. The rosemary planters are still visually cluttered, I assume. And somehow I've survived the scandal. Sometimes, early in the morning, I still think about the sound of those cruisers coming down the drive and the look on Diane's face behind them. She really believed that if she brought police to my property, the story she'd been whispering around the neighborhood would suddenly become true. Instead, they took my side. Not because they liked me, not because I made some dramatic speech, because I had the truth, the permits, the footage, and a woman across the street who had finally pushed her luck past the point where confidence could save her. That's the thing about bullies who borrow power. The moment real power shows up, the costume starts to fall apart. How did you like the story? Subscribe to my YouTube channel.